Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashodjitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Guti Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madanamohano Vairagya Yug Bhakti Rasam Prayatnair Apayayan Mam Anubhipsu Mandam Kripam Bhudiya Paraduka Duki Sanatanam Tam Prabhu Mashrayami. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the foremost of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, Sri Sanatana Gosvamipada. Again, today we will continue our discussion of the section on Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa. So as we've discussed, as we're making our way through the Sanatana Shiksha, we've come to the section about Saranagati. So before going through that portion of Mahaprabhu's teaching of Saranagati to Sanatan, we're looking at how Sanatan has represented Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa after he sat to write according to the inspiration that Mahaprabhu filled his heart with. So we're in our third session on this section, and we're picking up from about halfway through in verse 15. So we're in the Mahatmya section, and we're hearing statements from various Puranas, and we'll probably get to some of the later statements from the Bhagavatam, which show the various powers or wonders or benefits of Saranagati. So, I will resume. So, this is from verse 15. Vamane Sri Prahlad Bali Sangbade. In the Vamana Puran, in the conversation of Sri Prahlad and Bali. Jesam Shrita Harim Anantimanadi Madhyam Narayanam Suragurum Shubhadam Varenyam Shuddham Kagendra Gamanam Kamalalayisham Te Dharma Raja Karanam Navishanti Dhira. The resolute who are fully sheltered in Hari, he who is without end, without beginning and middle, the refuge of all beings, the guru of the suras, the bestower of well-being, most worthy of worship, pure, he whose movement is upon the king of birds, namely Garuda, and the lord of Kamala, meaning the lord of Lakshmi's abode, namely Vaikunta, do not fall to the share of Dharmaraj's scribe. So Dharmaraj has the duty of allocating appropriate consequences for everyone's actions, and he does so according to the records kept of this by Chitragupta, who's said to be his scribe. This is found in various Puranic accounts. So here it's saying that those who are fully sheltered in Hari, they don't show up on the notebook. In other words, they don't come under his jurisdiction. He doesn't take any notes on them. So Sanatana Pad explains the import of this as follows. Samashrita sharanam yataha dharma rajasya karanam kayastam tal likanam adikaram iti artaha. Those who are fully sheltered, that is, those who have taken shelter, do not fall to the share of Dharmaraja's scribe, that is, the jurisdiction of his records. That is, they do not they are not subject to any judgment or punishment from Dharmaraj whatsoever. This is the meaning because of the destruction of all sin. That is, all sins are destroyed by taking shelter fully in Hari, and thus those who are fully sheltered in him become sinless and do not perform any actions that Dharmaraja's scribes could or would ever enter into their records. As far as greatness, on the part of Sri Bhagavan is stated in the verse by means of the qualifiers, he who is without end, and so forth, on account of his being the cause of that is, of the destruction of all sin. As far as possible, there, meaning these qualifiers being the cause and effect of one another, is to be inferred. So, Sanatana Gosvamipada, in many cases, in his commentary on Hari-bhakti-vilasa, and in some cases also in his commentary on Dig-darsani, he asks the readers to infer from statements he makes, or according to guidelines he gives, the appropriate implication of verses that he's discussing. So in other words, he's not writing to just tell everyone what to think, he's writing to teach people how to think, so that they can infer properly the meaning of these statements, or at least have some good idea about how to do so. So he doesn't give any specific explanation of all these qualifiers mentioned in the verse, but usually it's understood that when a stack of qualifiers is given for one subject, there's an implied internal hierarchy among them in terms of cause and effect. So as to convey more than what's literally written, so to speak. So he's saying that this is how the text should be read, although he's not going into the detail of explaining that specifically. So I've had a go, if you will, at making an inference of which cause and effect exists among these qualifiers. So this is all, note carefully, in the bracket only. This is only me as the translator bracketing any additional points that aren't literally stated in the text. So I've had an attempt to follow what Sanatana Goswami is suggesting that the readers do, but I'm not guaranteeing that it's faultless or it's the only way of it being done. But one way that seems plausible to me is as follows. It can be inferred that there is a cause and effect relationship between a number of qualifiers of Hari employed in the verse to describe him. This may be thought out as follows. Because Hari, he who is the Lord of Lakshmi's abode, namely Vaikuntha, and whose movement is upon Garuda, is purity itself. He is capable of destroying all the sins of those who take shelter in him, and because he is without beginning, middle, and end, he is thus the refuge of all beings, thus the Guru of the Suras, meaning the Lord of all the Devatas, thus the bestower of well-being upon all, because you can't be the Lord of everyone unless you do good for them, and thus most worthy of worship, because you can't be worthy of worship unless you actually benefit the people that worship you. The same is so ahead as well. That is, similar cause and effect relationships between the qualifiers employed to describe Sri Hari can also be inferred in forthcoming verses. So, this is, you could say, ornamental, if you will. The principal purpose of this citation is to indicate that Saranagati frees one from all sin. So just as was initially indicated in the citation from the celebrated verse near the end of the Gita, Sarva dharman parityaja mamekam sharanam braja aham tom sarva pabhyo mokshayishyami. As Krishna said, I will free you from all sins. So this point was made earlier, and now in the Mahatmya section it's being stated again. So this is one of the greatnesses of Saranagati, that those who take to it are protected or purified by Bhagavan of all sin that they may have committed. In other words, the consequences of sin are administered for the purpose of correction. Punishment is not in principle vindictive, it's actually for the betterment of those to whom it's given. And especially so in the case of the law of karma, or the arrangement of Bhagavan, so to speak. So, modern, governmental things, or, legal things, that's another category. I'm not going there with this. But in principle, that punishment is given to correct someone, to prevent them from doing activity that's harmful to themselves and others. But if the behavior that's in the person, or the mentality that's in the person, that's perpetuating the harm to the self or to the other, is actually removed, then is there any purpose of still subjecting the person to the punishment? No, it would become redundant at that point. So if the fundamental purpose of allocating all these consequences of sin is to prevent people from further sinning, from further harming themselves and others, if someone becomes a Sharanagata, if someone now adopts a mentality and a course of action in their life that's completely free from sin, then, and not only is free from sin, but is of the nature of the highest virtue, spiritually speaking, as well as practically speaking, then there's nothing to benefit, there's nothing to gain from subjecting them to such consequences of those past actions, because the necessity for correction that those consequences are administered has already been achieved. So in that sense, because there's no need and no benefit in them going through those things, they're considered to be free from them. Now, in other contexts, we also hear that in some cases, Bhagavan still allows certain consequences of past actions to come upon his bhaktas in a way that almost seems as if they're in the same condition as other persons in samsara. So in that way, the bhaktas will see that whatever comes to me is for my benefit, is Bhagavan's arrangement for me. And Chakravartipad, in his commentary on the verse Tate Nukampam Susamikshramanu, says that the consequences or the sufferings that bhaktas might go through that might look like the sufferings that people go through as a result of sins can be conceived to not be the consequences of sins at all, to not be the punishments allocated by Yamaraj, but rather to be the personal arrangements of Bhagavan himself, which in some cases are also punishments, or in other words, they may also be stern, or he compares it to a father feeding his son neem juice. Like, the boy may still find it bitter, he may still not like it, it may still not be fun, but that doesn't mean that it's merely some mundanity or some, consequences from your karma or something like that. That may also be the loving care, or, to use some modern word, they have this phrase, tough love, so to speak. It may also be what's being applied. So, anyway, overall, the purpose of the citation is to say that Bhagavan is the Lord of Vaikuntha, beyond this realm. He's pure by his very nature, he's infinite by his very nature, and therefore he can shelter and he can purify everyone, he can bring about the greatest well-being of everyone, and therefore he's most worthy of worship, most worthy of being taken shelter in. Okay, let's come to the next verse. Je shankya chakrabja karam sashanginam kagendra ketum varadam shriya patim samashrayante bhavabhitinasham tesham bhayam nasti vimukta bhajam. Those who take shelter fully in Shri's, that is Lakshmi's Lord, he who is replete with conch, disc, and lotus in hand, possessed of a bow, the pilot of the king of birds, the bestower of boons, and the destroyer of the fear of material existence, and are thus endowed with eminent mukti, have no fear. So a Sharanagata becomes fearless. This is, in gist, the statement. Just as, in a negative sense, a prince or the son of a rich man might have no fear in the dangerous sense of, recklessly spending money or recklessly treating people rudely, thinking no one will dare to stop them or something like that. When you're in the shelter of someone very powerful, then you think, because I have this great power to protect me, nothing can happen to me, I don't fear anything. So in the worldly context, that can be problematic, but in the spiritual context, this is a great, profound form of peace. When one is in the shelter of Bhagavan, and one trusts in his shelter and in his guardianship, then what does one have to fear? Whatever will come to you is not a cause of danger, is not a cause of harm. It's only the grace of Bhagavan. It's only Bhagavan's, protection for me. Be it maybe some tough love sometimes, in other words, might be some challenge sometimes, or might be something pleasant, whatever it is, because it's Bhagavan's protection for me, because it's Bhagavan's expression of care for me, there's nothing to fear from it. So with this mentality of a Sharanagata, one can heal all varieties of anxiety, paranoia, fear, etc. Not that one needs to then not have common sense, to, not go into a bad neighborhood in the wrong time of the night or something like this. Not that you use this as a, license to be reckless, but that in general, as a disposition in one's life, this becomes a source of great solace and a source of great strength. So the tika is as follows: Nekevalam evam naraka bhayam kshinam, kintu sangsara bhayam cha vinashtam. Parama pada praptir api jata iti aha je shanketi. Not only does fear of Naraka thus wane away, as a result of taking shelter fully in Sri Bhagavan, but fear of samsara becomes completely destroyed, and attainment of even the supreme abode becomes manifest, as a result of taking shelter fully in Sri Bhagavan. Thus, the author says, Yeshanka, that is, he cites this verse. So he's tying these statements together, because this is still a statement of Prahlad to Bali, continuing from the previous verse. So what's the progression of thought between the two verses? He's showing that in the commentary. So in the previous verse, by saying that you're not under the jurisdiction of Yamaraj's scribe, the implication is that you're not going to be punished by Yamaraj. And classically speaking, when people think Yamaraj, they think hell, they think Naraka. So to say that you're not going to be punished by him means you're never going to go to hell. You're never going to have to go to Naraka. So he's saying, so if the commentary starts, not only does fear of Naraka thus wane away, in other words, just that you're not going to suffer in Naraka, that's not the extent of the peace and of the effect of Sharanagati. That's just the beginning, so to speak. Rather, sangsara bhayam chavinashtam, not just Naraka, but the whole of samsara, you become free of that fear as well. In other words, the fear of perpetual transmigration within samsara, or the other fears that exist, or causes of danger that exist in samsara, fear of all of that is destroyed as well. And moreover, paramapada prapti api jata. And not only that, but one can attain the supreme abode of Bhagavan. So that's the purpose of that's why Prahlad says what he says in this second statement. Quote, those who take shelter fully, samashrayante, become endowed with imminent mukti, that is, vimukti, meaning residence in Vaikuntha. This is the primary result of taking shelter in Bhagavan, meaning becoming free from Naraka and free from fear of samsara are only secondary concomitant results. In other words, a Sharanagata doesn't take shelter in Bhagavan out of fear or with the hope of getting out of those dangers. Although they may initially, as in the case of Gajendra, when he was in distress, he said, Saiva mama sharanam, as Jiva Goswami rendered it, that in the state of distress, he realized, you're my only protector, and took shelter in him. But as it's explained in the Sindhu, and as we discussed earlier in the Adhikar Prakaran and the Charitamrita, that itself doesn't give one the adhikar for the path of bhakti, but that is the initial process that can then further result in one acquiring the eligibility for bhakti, if by turning to Bhagavan, one then acquires a disposition towards him that one isn't motivated only by freeing oneself or benefiting oneself from something by doing so, but rather by having conviction in his being most worthy of worship, and in the path of bhakti being one's true, most appropriate path of life, which is all related to the concept of Shraddha, which we've discussed at length earlier in this series on the Charitamrita. So basically what he's saying here is that the primary benefit or the primary consequence of taking shelter in Bhagavan is that you go to Bhagavan. You literally come into the company of Bhagavan. The fact that you get out of somewhere else or you're not somewhere else, that's not the point. That's a secondary effect of taking shelter in him. Okay, so I think that's clear. We'll come to the next statement. Brihan Naradiye Prayaschitta Prakaranante. In Brihad Naradiya Purana, at the end of the section on atonement, Sangsaresmin Mahaghore Mohanidra Samakule Jai Harim Sharanam Yanti Te Kritarta Na Samshaya. In the dense darkness of this samsara, engulfed in the slumber of delusion, those who take shelter in Hari become successful. There is no doubt. And he comments, Kritarta Siddha Sarvartaha. Successful means accomplished in all objects. So, the implication being, if you take shelter in Bhagavan, you can achieve anything and everything. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, as was described in the previous verses. And beyond that, for those following the path of Uttama Bhakti, Prem, Bhav for Bhagavan. So, whatever one so seeks, that will be achieved when one takes shelter in Bhagavan. In other words, he is he who can provide one with anything and everything. So if you come into his shelter, if you receive his favor, then what will you not attain? You will attain everything, as per your desire. So, be careful what you wish for, as we discussed earlier in that verse about Dhruva, earlier in the Sanatana Shiksha. So, thus, the progression of thought, we have, you become free from sin, in the first verse today. Second verse, not only do you become free from sin, not only free from naraka, not only free from samsara, you can even achieve Bhagavan's abode. And now he's saying, and not just Bhagavan's abode, but any object that you have, whatever success you may aspire for, that you can achieve. So this is relevant for those whose aim is not simply salokya mukti, but rather bhakti itself, prema itself. This statement, carries that. This citation carries this suggested import, if you will, that the successfulness that is sought by those on that path can also be considered to be alluded to here by this manner of citation. Okay, I come to the next verse. Brahma Purane Karmana manasa vacha ye chuttam sharanam gataha na samarto yamaste sham te mukti phalabhaginaha. Yama is not capable of administering punishment in regard to they who have taken shelter in Achyuta, with their actions, mind, and speech, as they are possessors of the result of mukti. The Tika. Tesham na samartha jate pi pape kinchit kartum na shaknuyat iti artaha. Yama is not capable in regard to them means he will not be able to do anything even if ever a sin on their part somehow occurs. Yato mukte phalam bhakti vaikunta lokapraptir va tadbhaginaha. As, meaning what's the reason that he can't do anything? They are possessed of the attainment of mukti, that is, bhakti, or attainment of Sri Vaikuntha Loka. So Sanatana Goswami is interpreting the word mukti here to refer to bhakti, or to refer to the attainment of Vaikuntha. So someone who's gone to Vaikuntha is not under Yamaraja's jurisdiction, and someone who's attained bhakti, who's come to the path of bhakti, is no longer under the jurisdiction of Yama, no longer subject to the rules of the Karma Marg. They've now come to the Bhakti Marg, so now they're under Bhagavan's own jurisdiction, so to speak, and therefore Yamaraj cannot, so to speak, is not capable in regard to them. So this point is elaborated on especially in the 6th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, when Ajamil engages in Namabhas, and the Vaikuntha Dutas swoop down and shock the Yama Dutas, who, are doing their duty to carry away Ajamil to the court of Yamaraj, and suddenly are stopped from doing so, and then learn from the Vishnu Dutas how they don't have, nor does Yamaraj have any jurisdiction over persons who take the name of Bhagavan. So this is a point that is very significant to the narratives in the Bhagavatam, as well as in the greatness of Bhagavan's name. So that point I think is people are well acquainted with. So I'm not going to elaborate in detail on that whole section of the Bhagavatam here, the details of that. In gist, what he wants to point out by this citation is to, again, this is in the greatness of Saranagati section, so another statement that shows the same import that we heard earlier, that Yamaraj is not capable in these persons. So you might say, well then isn't this redundant? Why is he quoting this verse again if he's already made the same point in an earlier verse? So one way we can see a non-redundancy is that there's this specification of taking shelter in action, speech, and mind. So this is also showing that Saranagati requires, or to truly reach that state of being beyond Yamaraj's scope, one has to take shelter in all of these faculties. And I won't elaborate on the significance of that now, because that's a point that Sanatana Pad returns to in the final portion of this discussion of Saranagati, where he gets into the lakshanas, which from a sadhaka perspective or a practical perspective is really where the nitty-gritty comes in. In other words, we can hear all these statements about how wonderful Saranagati is, but then what really matters is how do we actually do it? And how does that actually become a reality in our life? So that's where the section ends when he discusses the lakshanas. So we'll get to that. All right. So the next citation, Dashamaskande in the 10th canto of the Bhagavat. This verse comes at the end of the Brahma Vimohan Leela, at the end of Brahma's praises of Bhagavan. So he says, Samashritaye pada pallavaplavam mahat param punya yasho murare bhavam buddhir vatsa param 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 yad viparam natesham. So some nice alliteration with the word pada in this verse. I'll read it one more time just for fun. Samashritaye pada palavaplavam mahat param punya yasho murare bhavam buddhir vatsa param 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 yad viparam natesham. For those who have taken shelter fully in the abode of the Mahats, the boat that is the blossom-like feet of he of pure fame, Murari. The ocean of material existence becomes a calf's hoofprint, and the supreme abode, not that domain which is the abode of adversities, becomes the abode to which they belong. In other words, when you take shelter in Bhagavan, then samsara becomes insignificant, and you become a member, or your natural place becomes Bhagavan's own abode. So Sanatana Pad gives a little bit more elaborate commentary here. Evam Shri Krishnasya eva paramartatvat parama mahatmyatat cha tad ekasharananam ayatna siddham eva parama padam iti prakaranartam upasangharan aha samashrita iti. In this way, on account of specifically Sri Krishna's being the supreme object, and on account of his supreme greatness, the supreme abode is attained verily without effort by those whose shelter is solely in him. Thus, summarizing the aim of the section, he says, Samashrita, that is, he cites this verse. So I've given a footnote here because a lot of Sanatana Pad's commentary on the Hari-bhakti-vilasa, when it comes to citations from Bhagavatam, is in some cases verbatim repetition of the Bhavavarta-dipika, and in many cases slight or significant elaboration upon statements from the Bhavavarta-dipika. So in this is also a case of that, and so this phrase that prakaranartam upasangharang, or summarizing the meaning of the section, this statement is made. This isn't a statement of Sanatan commenting on the Hari-bhakti-vilasa specifically, because when you read it here, you'd think, okay, now this section is ending with this statement, but then we see that this section on the Mahatma and Saranagati goes on for a number of additional verses. So it might look like an error, or it might not make sense. And in fact, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was studying this text. So then you always have to check everything against the Bhavavarta-dipika, and then you see, oh, Samipad says the exact same thing. So the quote prakarana here is not this Sharanagati prakaran in Hari-bhakti-vilasa, but the prakaran in the Bhagavatam in which Brahma is offering his praises to Krishna. So this statement then is specific to that context and that section. And this indeed comes at the very end of Brahma's stuv, when he is given this very elaborate set of praises of Krishna, from which the verse I quoted earlier, Tat Te Nukampam, and many other celebrated verses come. So in that section, you have Brahma, who's now freshly realized the greatness of Sri Krishna to be greater than even that of Narayan, greater than even that of Brahma's own father, whom Brahma considered to be the supreme Bhagavan. So this is something that the Caritamrta discusses in detail in the Adi Lila chapter 2, and also is analyzed in the Bhagavat Sandarbha by Jiva Gosvamipada. So in this context, what's significant is Brahma's realization of Krishna specifically in contrast to Bhagavan in general. Because Brahma initially didn't recognize Krishna to be Bhagavan at all, much less the most ultimate or wonderful form of Bhagavan. So then after this manifestation where he sees not just that Narayan manifests from Krishna, but that Krishna manifests an infinity of Narayans, which is, you can say, vastly more astounding than even the universal form that Arjuna perceived in the Bhagavad Gita, then Brahma realizes that Krishna is here, quote, the paramarta, or there can be no greater object, no greater entity or thing to be perceived, thing to be realized than Krishna. So Krishnasya eva paramartatvat, and parama mahatmya tat cha, and therefore Krishna's greatness is superlative in comparison even to all other forms of Bhagavan. So tadeka sharananam, so what then is the position of those who take shelter in Krishna specifically? In other words, the distinction comes, you can take shelter in Bhagavan. In the previous verses we've read, there are obviously references to taking shelter in Narayan. He's described as the Lord of Lakshmi's abode, as he who rides on Garuda, as he who carries the conch and the club and all this. So here you have a statement that's giving a specific emphasis and saying that when the form of Bhagavan that you take shelter in is of even internally comparable, greater spiritual excellence, if you will, then to be sheltered in that form of Bhagavan can be considered even more effective or even more powerful. Now, we don't say that in any way to imply that there's any deficiency in taking shelter in Narayan, or that persons who worship Narayan as their Ishta Devata will not achieve his abode or not achieve mukti or not achieve. We're not trying to make any kind of disparaging implication in any way whatsoever. But nevertheless, that there's some sort of spiritual excellence or wonder in being sheltered in Krishna specifically. This is, you can say, a very Gaudiya-specific viewpoint, which Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, and here Sanatana Goswami are also taking, making efforts to draw out. So then he qualifies that by saying, Ayatna siddham eva paramapadam, that even without attempting, or without even trying, they achieve the supreme abode. Means it comes to them just in a natural course of being in Krishna's shelter. So this is what is being implied by this verse that's just being quoted. So this idea that his feet are like a boat that you cross over samsara, the idea is that not only is it a boat that you cross over samsara with difficulty, but easily. So that's what comes next. And I'll just say, if anyone's ever, I don't know if everyone's had the experience, but if you ever actually go in a boat on the open ocean, you'll know that this is not an easy experience. I don't know, I've never been on a cruise or anything like that, but if you've ever been a small boat on the open ocean, it's very turbulent, and what you call seasickness is a reality. And at least the only time that I ever did it, many people puked on the boat. I wasn't one of them, thankfully, but the idea is that, I just bring up this example to say that traveling across an ocean on a boat isn't the implication of this metaphor is not something easy. So to say that his feet are like a boat and the ocean becomes like a hoof print, in other words, it becomes so tiny that you cross it just the way when you're walking, you take a step, you step over a hoof print without even noticing it. It's effortlessly crossed over without having to, quote unquote, break stride or make any separate effort or even pay attention. You just, in the natural course of taking the step that you would have already taken, whether you noticed the hoof print or not, you would have already crossed over it. Like that, you just crossed it. You didn't even have to be aware of doing so, much less have to undergo the hardship of seasickness and all of this. So this is the implied sense, or that there's this effortless, smooth transcendence that's so so subtle, if you will, that it's almost as if one doesn't realize that it happens. So detail on that is given in the later part of the commentary. He says, Punyam yasho yasya sa, punya yasha sa, cha aso muraris cha, tasya padapalava eva plabaha, tam samyag ashritaha mahatpadam mahatam padam ashrayam, yadva mahatcha sarvot krishtam cha tadpadam cha iti. Tata tesham bhavam budhir vatsapada matram bhavati anayasena moksha syat iti artaha tasya anushangitkatvena swata siddhehe. So he says, for those who have taken shelter fully in that boat specifically, the blossom-like feet of he whose fame is pure, that is, Murari, which is the abode, that is, shelter of the Mahats, or, alternately, which is an abode that is great, or Mahat, meaning most excellent in comparison to all. The ocean of material existence becomes just a calf's hoofprint, meaning moksha shall come about for them without any difficulty, because of the attainment by them of that of its own accord, on account of its being concomitant. That is, its being a natural, unsought, secondary result of taking shelter in Sri Krishna's feet. So it's a long sentence. Inside there, what he's doing is, one point he's making is that the compound Mahat Padam, he's giving two interpretations of this. He's saying that Mahat can be an adjective describing the Pada, so it can be just a great abode, or you can take it that it's the Mahat refers to Mahatmas or Mahajans or great Bhaktas, great sadhus, and that Bhagavan's feet are their abode or their shelter. So he gives these two interpretations. And then the phrase Punya Yasha, that he is, whose fame is pure, the sense here is that some people's fame is impure, or in other words, you can become infamous or you can become notorious for, in other words, well known for doing bad things. So he's well known, but he's well known in a pure way. In other words, he's well known for things that are virtuous. He's well known for things that are of the highest good. And although it's not given here, other commentators, and I haven't included the viewpoints of other commentaries on this because there's a lot of commentary on this verse and you can interpret it in many ways, but if we jump into that, you could give it easily a whole class just on the commentaries on this verse, so I don't want to overdo it. But the word punyam, which I've given here as an adjective, as pure, also can convey the sense of purifying. So the other sense of punya yasho means he whose fame or whose greatness or whose glories is purifying. The import being then that by chanting his glories, by hearing his katha, in other words, by talking about him, by hearing kirtans about him, by hearing these texts about him, etc., then that purifies those who speak those things, those who hear those things. So that then implies that the way that you transcend samsara effortlessly is by sitting down and hearing some Hari Katha. In other words, by hearing Bhagavad Katha, you become purified. The elements that bind you within samsara become, washed away from your psyche by the teachings, by the, multifarious effects and benefits of hearing about Bhagavan. So, anyway, this is Punya Yasha. So Murari, or Krishna, who has this pure fame or this purifying fame, and whose feet are the shelter of all Mahatmas, the import of that would be that to be a Mahatma, you must have some level of bhakti, be it pure bhakti, or in the case of Jnani Mahatmas, at least the acceptance of bhakti as a means, or that his feet are the ultimate or the greatest shelter of all, which is in line with the viewpoint that began this commentary, this idea that Krishna is the supreme object even in comparison to Narayan. So for those who take shelter in that abode of Krishna's feet, then you cross over the ocean of material existence becomes like a calf's hoof print. So, it's a classical analogy. It might sound a little bit funny, but the idea is that a hoof print holds water. So it's like a commonly recognized very, very tiny amount of water. So to compare an ocean to the amount of water left in a hoof print, in other words, a tiny amount of water that a villager in ancient India would see any day of the week when they walked out on the path of their village and saw all the cows, footprints along the path, something that they would be well acquainted with in the course of their daily life. So to say that this ocean becomes just like these hoof prints that you step over every day while you walk out, around wherever you're going, what's the import of that? Anasena moksha syat, that easily or without, any separate effort or without any great difficulty, moksha is had. Kimcha, param padam Sri Vaikuntakyam padam stanam bhavati. Moreover, the supreme abode, namely Sri Vaikunta, becomes their abode. So not only do they cross over samsara, but beyond that, they reach Vaikuntha. Bipadam yat padam vishayas tat puna karachedapi tesham na bhavati. Na tata punar avartante iti artaha. Okay, so the supreme abode, Vaikuntha, becomes their abode, and not ever again, at any time, that which is an abode that is a domain of adversities, or vipadam, meaning they never return from there, meaning from Vaikuntha, to material existence, or samsara. So here he's interpreting the phrase vipadam in contrast to this parampadam. So once you reach this parampadam, then you're never left, or you're never subject again to vipadam, or this, plane of materiality. So again, emphasizing that moksha is achieved secondarily by virtue of Saranagati. Alright, then I think we have time for one more. So now another statement from the Bhagavad. This is in the first canto. Pratame Yat pada samashraya sutta munaya prashamayanaha sadhya punan dupasritya svardunyapo nusevaya. O Sutta, sages who have taken shelter fully in whose, meaning Bhagavan's feet, and are thus on the path of complete equanimity, immediately purify others, even upon being nearly touched. Means not actually touched, but even nearly touched. The waters of the Svardhani, however, do so only as a result of repeated honoring. In other words, to purify yourself completely, you have to take a bath in the Ganga many times, my friend. In other words, just taking the bath in the Ganga is not going to purify you all that swiftly. But he's saying, without even having to bathe, in other words, not even coming in touch, but even coming near the sadhus who are Sharanagatas, one is purified immediately. So he's making a comparison in this way. So let's look at the commentary. Evam Sri Bhagavat Sharanapananam Kramena Bhavadukadi Abhavam Paramapada Praptim Cha Likitva Aduna Te Anyadapi Nistarayanti Iti Likati Yatpadaiti. So having thus described sequentially elimination of the miseries of material existence and so forth, and attainment of the supreme abode for those who have taken shelter in Sri Bhagavan's feet, the author now states that they deliver others as well. Yatparam, he cites this verse. So we're in the section on the Mahatmya, the greatness of Sharanagati. So he's summarizing what he said so far. What is the greatness of Sharanagati? It frees you from the miseries of material existence, and it leads to your attainment of Bhagavan's abode, the supreme abode. So now he's adding another point and saying, and not only does Sharanagati benefit the Sharanagata in these two ways, but the Sharanagata, by virtue of Sharanagati, benefits others as well, purifies others in addition to themselves. So that's the purpose of this citation. He Sutta, Yasya Bhagavataha Pado Eva Samshayo Yesham Te Sharanagata Iti Artaha. Atev Prashama Prakrishta Shanti Rupam Ayanam Vartma Sharanapati Lakshanam Yesham Yadva Prashamo Ayanam Sharanapati Sadhanam Yesham Yadva Prakrishta Shama Sukam Yasmat Saprashama Prema Tamayante Prapnubanti Iti Tathabhuta Munaya Upasrishta Sanidhi Matrena Sevita Santaha Punanti. So here, Sanatana gets a little bit elaborate. In other words, gives numerous alternate interpretations, saying, O Sutta, sages, they who have taken shelter fully in whose, that is in Sri Bhagavan's feet alone, meaning they who are Sharanagatas, and thus, quote, completely equanimous, or prashama. So this point now he elaborates on. So he's saying to be a Sharanagata is to be completely equanimous. If one is an actual Sharanagati, one will have Sharanagata, one will have complete equanimity. So what then is the equanimity spoken of here? Then he explains it in multiple ways as follows. Number one, they whose path, or ayanam, is that the form of which is complete tranquility, which is a characteristic of Sharanapati. So this is a thought, a matter worthy of thought. He's saying that to be a Sharanagata is to be equanimous, completely. And to be completely equanimous means to be on the path of complete peace, or tranquility, shanti. So what does this mean? That means that Sharanagatas are those, specifically, meaning not others, only Sharanagatas are those who are on the path of complete shanti. So sometimes in Western culture, there's a generic characterization of pop culture appreciation of Hinduism as people sitting around chanting Om Shanti or something like this. So, you can say that there's this sort of stereotype that people who take interest in Hindu practice are people who are fond of or value this concept of Shanti. So here we find this idea that the epitome of that, or the essence of being on the path to, or something that will lead to actual Shanti, is Sharanagati. So if you want Shanti, if you want peace, then what is the path to that? It is Sharanagati. This is one interpretation. Then, second interpretation. They whose path is complete equanimity means, which is a means of accomplishment of Sharanagati. Okay, so then here he's giving a different interpretation by saying that if you follow Sharanagati, you end up in a state of Shanti completely. Or the second interpretation is that to reach Sharanagati, the means to that is Shanti. Okay? So, and by Shanti, rather we mean prashama, the actual word, and then in that context, it means to truly be a Sharanagata, one has to learn equanimity. So this is also very thoughtful because, when we sit in front of the deity to say our prayers, we can say prayers about being a Sharanagata. But then when we walk out the door and we walk down the street and we are living our practical life and communicating with people and interacting with other living beings, then if we don't also bear in mind that the very Bhagavan who we pray to in the form of the Thakur is also living in the heart of every one of those beings, and that the behavior that we engage in with every one of them is also part of that relationship that we have with Bhagavan, is also reflecting on the extent to which we sustain consistent awareness of him, to the extent to which in our speech, in our behavior, as well as our thoughts, we actually live in alignment with that ideal of being sheltered in him. So we won't actually follow the path, or we won't actually reach that state of Sharanagati unless we learn equanimity, or unless we learn how to have an equal mind towards everything in our environment, towards all the people, places, and things that we interact with. And what is that equanimity? What is that equality of mind? That is recognition or awareness of the presence of the Ishta Devata within all. And this is a topic that Jiva Goswami spoke on, and specifically on Anucheda 106 in the Bhakti Sandarbha, which has many very insightful points for anyone following the classes we do on Padyavali. We had some elaborate discussion of that in reference to the Trinadapi Sunichena verse some time back. So this point is very significant, in my personal opinion. In other words, to this idea that we don't actually reach the state of Sharanagati unless we can follow this path of equanimity, unless we can learn to see everything integrated, or everything is part of in an equal way, and that equality is based on the singularity of recognition of everything unfolding in the context of our relationship with Bhagavan. Every respect that we show to everyone is respect to Bhagavan. Every kind gesture that we speak is the kind gesture to Bhagavan, etc. In that analysis, one very nice point that comes in the same subject matter that's discussed in Anucheda 106 of the Bhakti Sandarbha, but not mentioned in the six Sandarbhas themselves, but only mentioned in the Krama Sandarbha, where Jiva Goswami, which he wrote later, adds, in my opinion, a very significant point. This is something I mentioned in those earlier classes, but because I think it's such a nice point, I'm saying it again, which is that he makes a comparison between Bharat Maharaj and Ranti Dev, two different Mahatmas described in the Bhagavatam. So Bharat Maharaj is recognized to have fallen or suffered a setback on the path of bhakti because his bhakti to Bhagavan slackened as a result of his affection and his nurturing of a baby deer. And this is, a very strong teaching in the Bhagavatam about the fixity that is required to follow the path of bhakti, and that even conventional kindness or conventional good doing can lead to one's undoing in following the path of pure bhakti. However, there's also a description in the 9th canto, later in the Bhagavatam, of Ranti Dev, who goes about feeding everyone in his kingdom to the point of completely depleting his own resources, to the complete of even not feeding his own family or himself. And similarly to Bharat Maharaj, is deeply engaged in looking after the welfare of his fellow living beings in this world. And, you might think, or it might seem, that he's doing the same thing that Bharat Maharaj is doing. In other words, he's not only sitting and chanting the japa mantram of his Ishta Devata, or only doing worship of a vigraha of his Ishta Devata. He's out there feeding people. But what Jiva Goswami explains is that Ranti Dev is said to have achieved siddhi by doing this, whereas Bharat Maharaj is said to have suffered a setback, or having to be reborn in the form of a deer and then again in the form of Jad Bharat, because Jad Bharat had internally slackened in his observance of the path of bhakti, where he was caring for the deer for the sake of the deer. Whereas Ranti Dev was serving other persons in his kingdom, he was caring for his subjects, but he was doing so with the mentality that his Ishta Devata is present in the heart of all of these people, and in service to that Ishta Devata, he is caring for, or he is nourishing these persons who are, the vessels of his Ishta Devata, so to speak. So he did this with awareness and as an expression of, or a manner of cultivating bhakti, rather than something in contrast to it. So Jiva Goswami makes this distinction and says, for that reason, Bharat Maharaj achieved a different result than Ranti Dev. Ranti Dev achieved siddhi just by doing that. So the reason I bring this whole topic is this idea of equanimity. How can we be equanimous in our life in the world, where sometimes we may be with so-called, I don't mean in a negative sense, but in like a technical sense, Vaishnavas. In other words, people who've undergone a rite of initiation and wear tilak on their forehead and, greet us with their preferred, invocation of the name of their Ishta Devata, whatever it may be. This type of thing. When we interact with these people, we may naturally have a tendency to remember Bhagavan, to see that caring for them, treating them well, serving them is a way of serving Bhagavan. But then when we, go somewhere else, or we see people that aren't ostensibly Vaishnavas, then we, think, oh, this has nothing to do with that. Or we make a distinction such that that can result in our behavior being lesser or lacking in due respect, in due kindness, and so forth. So, that can be adjusted by having this type of vision, having this type of equanimity, which is mentioned in this second interpretation. So he's saying you don't actually get to the state of Saranagati without prashama, without this complete equanimity of mind, which I'm contextualizing with this reference to these other teachings of Jiva Goswami, that you can maintain an equanimity of mind only by a constant remembrance of Bhagavan. Because after all, Smartavya Jatuchit, never forget Bhagavan, always remember Bhagavan. This is the principle that all of their principles serve. So the only equanimity for a bhakta is constant remembrance of Bhagavan, constant remembrance of the Ishtadevata. So how is that achieved? It's achieved by recognizing the presence of the Ishtadevata in all, and serving and honoring that presence through a behavior that's appropriate to the person or the object that one is interacting with. In other words, practically speaking, you just be a good person. You just act nice and appropriately with whoever you're interacting with, according to the social norms and the, whatever is meritorious. But with this, understanding of the presence of Bhagavan, with this equanimity that's spoken of there. In that way, one can sustain equanimity. In that way, one can reach the state of always feeling oneself to be in the shelter of Bhagavan. So, okay, sorry, that's a little bit elaborate explanation of the second interpretation. And it looks like we're out of time. So, this is a long commentary. I'd rather not rush it because there's some other very nice points in here. So, I'll just read through the rest of this sentence, just to at least finish the sentence, but maybe next time we can revisit this because this is a rich point in this discussion. So the third explanation of being, quote, completely equanimous or prashama is they who are such that they attain complete equanimity, meaning prema. So he's saying prashama can also mean prema. You're not completely equanimous unless you have prema for Bhagavan. So that on account of which complete peace, that is happiness, ensues. So why is prema equated with equanimity? Because once you get prema, then you experience complete peace, or you experience complete happiness. Stringing the sentence together, he's saying sages, those who have taken shelter in Bhagavan, and are thus completely equanimous, meaning who have this state of equanimity or who have this prema, what do? Then coming up to this sentence, they purify others upon being nearly touched. That is, honored just by nearness. That is, people become purified just by coming into the presence of sages of the aforesaid nature. So sages of this caliber, purified people just by their presence. The Ganga, you may bathe many times, but not be purified to the same extent that the presence of such a Mahatma does. So we'll finish the rest of the commentary next time. I'll conclude here, and I'm glad to see the connection didn't break. Today I was very much thinking it might. So very well. So if anyone has any comments, corrections, questions, or anything else, please feel free. Yes, I see a hand.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
Pranam. Dandavat Pranam Babaji and all the devotees. Baba, I have two questions. One just on equanimity or equal mind. You gave like brilliant explanation or like half of it just now. Thank you very much for it. And I understood a lot of things through it, that it's how to. My question is like more on the practical point, how to be of equal mind, how to develop it, especially in the circumstances which are difficult, like the war, or it is like something when something bad is happening to us. Because I understood, thank you very much, like this brilliant explanation that it's important to acknowledge the presence of Ishta Devata within all, and it helps a lot. But for example, when I think, for example, myself in retrospect, back in my like life history, for example, I have been within very difficult circumstances like the war, and how, for example, to see Bhagavan, like why this is war is happening, or why something like negative is happening in life, how to stay of equal mind in these kind of circumstances. This is the first question.
Well, I mean, there's many things that can be said about that. I'll just say something relatively short because we're already a little bit over time. There's there's narrative approaches, if you will, to this, a little bit like referring to some of the aspects of the interpretations of the Tate Nukampam versa that we discussed earlier. But in a simple way, without even having to narrativize it, one can just say, whatever's happening to me now, this is happening to me by the will of Bhagavan. This is coming to me from Bhagavan. Just that much, and why and how. Okay, you can get into that if you want, but you don't necessarily have to. And so, even if we can remember that much, that's enough. In other words, if we have that immediate sense that this is coming to me from Bhagavan, how I want to respond to this is the way that I want to behave when I'm with Bhagavan. In other words, he with whom I want my behavior to be as good as it ever could be. Then if I can just even remember that I'm in his presence or that I'm in a circumstance that is being brought to me from him, then that will immediately bring to mind or bring to my attention that ideal that I cherish, that I want to always behave in a way that is ideal in reciprocation with that. So if then, practically speaking, how do we do that? The answer I'll give at this moment is that there aren't necessarily any magic tricks. Rather, it's the continued daily sadhana that we do throughout our life that deepens our bhakti samskar, which will just support us at those moments of challenge. In other words, if we've done consistent bhakti sadhana over the course of years and we keep hearing Harikatha and we keep chanting Bhagavan's name and we keep consciously trying to practice these things, then even if, broadly speaking, distractions arise, maybe, in other words, dangerous circumstances or difficult circumstances arise, if that samskar is very deep in us, then the mind will come to that. It's not even that we'll have to think of that. If truly we have a deep bhakti samskar, that's just how the mind itself will go. So that's kind of a simple, broad answer, is just the more we cultivate all of these things, the daily practices that we do, the deeper the samskar becomes, the more the mind becomes trained, if you will, to conceive and therefore perceive the environment in this way. And then the fruit of all that cultivation, so to speak, will be that even in the midst of dangerous circumstances, as what we've read today, we won't necessarily become paranoid and anxious and freaked out and scared, and we'll be able to remember he who's the source of the greatest shelter and peace and comfort that there could ever be, Bhagavan himself. And if we can have that presence of mind, then we might not be able to change the circumstances that we're in, but we can go through it in as, simply speaking, nice of a way that you ever could. So I don't want to elaborate too much at this point, but I'll just say that much.
Thank you very much, Papa. And I have one more short question, which is, I apologize to devotees who may be already clear on this one, but it's something which is described on the page 2 of the Saranagati file, which is the definition or interpretation of Saranagati itself as acquiring a particular mentality, manovriti, which is I belong to Bhagavan and I am Bhagavan's. And then a little bit later, it's stated that the definition of Saranagati should be taken as separate from Atmanivedana. when I read this, I have a little bit of a dissonance in my mind, because before I always like thought that Sharanagati, that Atmanivedana is included in Sharanagati itself. And I don't know how to understand that Atmanivedana is being separate from Sharanagati. I'm sorry if everyone is clear on this one, but like, could you please a little bit direct, like, how should I perceive this?
Sure, this topic will also be discussed again later when we come to the Lakshanas of Sharanagati. So there we'll see a verse which mentions 6 limbs of Sharanagati, one of which is Atmanivedana. So from one perspective, Sharanagati is a general thing that Atmanivedana is a consequence of, or an expression of. And for Sharanagati as it's defined there to be complete, then Atmanivedana is quote unquote also required. So in that sense, you can conceive of as of Atmanivedana being integral to quote unquote complete Sharanagati. Nevertheless, Sanatana Goswami's point in the verse that was discussed at the beginning, which is very significant, is that he's saying that Sharanagati doesn't, in and of itself, is not entirely Atmanivedana. In other words, to have this understanding, I belong to Bhagavan. Kevalam Bhagavadiyo ham etavat matram. Right? He uses very sharp language. Only I am Bhagavan's. This much. So he's trying to get the person to crop it right there. In other words, and therefore I offered myself to him. He's saying, no. Not even that much. Even if you don't physically offer the self, but even if you just have the mentality that you belong to him, he's saying that much is Sharanagati. And then on top of that, to also physically offer the body or put the body at the disposal of Bhagavan, that is Atmanivedana. So, as this is a topic that also comes in the Sindhu, and it's explained that actually practically no one does Atmanivedana. It's like almost impossible because what Atmanivedana actually implies is like literally like sitting down somewhere and like waiting for food to come in your mouth and not doing anything unless it does. In other words, it's just literally completely putting oneself at the disposal of Bhagavan. There's an example in the Bhagavatam of this, of someone who takes up this, I think it's called the Ujja Vritti or something like this, where they adopted the mode of a python, where a python will just go somewhere and open its mouth and then just remain motionless in camouflage until something climbs in. So something like that, to literally not make any action with the body for the sake of sustaining the body, but to just literally say, this body is in the care of Bhagavan, it will be fed by Bhagavan. The way a cow that's sold can't feed itself unless the person comes and feeds it. So in the Sindhu, the analysis is that this is extremely difficult, and going to that degree of extreme is not required for everyone. So that's the point that Sanatana Goswami is trying to bring out here, that not everyone may go to that literal physical, what do you call that, like continuation, or that literal practical extenuation of the principle to its ultimate literal degree, but rather that he made the statement that for those who are unable to do all these other types of bhakti, still there is Sharanagati. So that means even for those who are incapable of Atmanivedana, there is still this practice of Sharanagati. So that was something we discussed in the opening class, and something that we'll also discuss in the later classes when we get to the Lakshanas again. So I hope that gives some clarity on the topic.
Yes, Baba. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Then next.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
Jai Radhe. Thank you so very much. This is interesting because practicing Sharanagati, what I'm understanding is make, just like you mentioned, Atma-nivedana, it's basically passivity in surrender. And I think this requires guidance of Guru. All Saranagati has to be done under guidance of Guru, because someone may take up Saranagati, like for example, Atma-nivedana, and completely hurt himself or herself in the process, not being able to understand one's own ability to practice. So I know that some self-reflection is required in order to practice, but still, that's my experience that although Sharanagati is very promising, it's important and develops a great sense of progress, yet from my experience and that you confirm today, just a way of passive life in a way, which doesn't really fit into like way of existence in material world, which requires actually maneuvering through all different difficulties and going through life with fighting obstacles and dealing with issues as a person goes on in life. And I find it conflicting actually. And then my conclusion is, just like now we're talking about it, that it really, one has to be under guidance of Guru, and Sharanagati requires actually Guru supervision in like very close attention in order to practice properly. Otherwise, someone may hurt himself or herself in the process. Am I correct to say that?
Yeah, I think when you say Sharanagati right now, you're mainly referring specifically to what we discussed as Atma-nivedana, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I would say don't try that at home. But, take up any literal attempt at that only with, having discussed that and received specific instruction. Otherwise, not recommended for everybody. Even doing general practices of bhakti is challenging enough. To try to do what Rupa Goswami calls very difficult, not a good idea, Don't try to get on the double black diamond if you're struggling with other green hills, so to speak, if I can use a ski resort analogy.
But what if somebody has done this for years? They'll fail. That's more difficult once it's done, right?
Yeah, and the other thing is it's not essential. It's not that if we don't go to that extreme, then we're nowhere, I mean, it's not that, it's not that one has to literally do every single anga of bhakti, that there are all these angas and different people, according to their stage, their samskar, their circumstance, they can achieve siddhi in all these different means. But it's not that all of them are applicable for everyone or all of them are compulsory for everyone. And something like that is, as I said, is exceedingly rare for it to be practicable, especially for people in today's world.
But I think that may create sense of remorse if somebody fails in the practice or finds himself completely, what have I done to myself by, practicing the Hari-bhakti, and then now I'm in a condition that actually requires opposite action to repair, to continue existence, physical existence. So would it create a sense of remorse? I mean, there's a scope of creating remorse in the process. Is it not?
Sorry, I didn't follow what you meant.
That someone who took up the high practices and realized that in the process he must have hurt himself or herself, would it create a remorse? A remorse that why have I done it? Why haven't that I'm too high, and realizing that that was over the top, like, and basically realizing after many years perhaps that what I was doing, it's not for me, and there may be created sense of remorse in the process that I was told in Shastra to practice, but then I did it and created
I don't know if you were told in Shastra to do it. If you ended up doing something that you weren't qualified to do, then that definitely wasn't what the Shastra had said to do. But sure, if someone tries to practice a particular way and then realizes that it's beyond their capability, they might feel remorse for that to some extent. They also might feel peace of mind and more clear sense of self-knowledge about who they are and where they are, and some good old humility. So, it's not necessarily bad as such.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's it for today then. So I'll sign off here, and if we're so blessed, then next week we'll continue further into this Saranagati Prakaran of Hari-bhakti-vilasa. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe.